Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are so very happy to have you here with us today. Today's webinar is titled Making a Mark with Makerspaces, and my name is Jenny Okers. I'm a Director of Marketing here with Learner's Edge. Each day we talk with teachers just like you who are seeking strategies to help them in their classroom. And because we know you are always looking for ways to help improve your teaching and your students' learning, we've put together this webinar with the hope that you can take these suggestions and put them to use in your classroom right away. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items to help you understand how you can participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of what you should be seeing as an attendee. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop up in the upper right-hand corner. Most of you are already using the audio on your computer, but if for some reason that method isn't as clear, do feel free to listen via phone using the numbers provided right within that attendee panel. We definitely encourage you to send us questions throughout the presentation. You can use the questions pane of the control panel. Send in your questions at any time. We'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If we run out of time, we'll do our best to send you individualized responses after today's webinar. Also notice the hand with the arrow within your control panel. We may be asking for a show of hands during today's webinar. You can click the hand to raise it or put it down. Also notice there's handouts available for you to download. Just right down there under the handout section in your user panel. Finally, within 24 hours of today's presentation, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded version of the webinar, along with all the slides and handouts that were shared today. So thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I know some of you may be on spring break, so happy spring break to all of you. And with that, I am thrilled to introduce my colleagues, Nancy Lindfors and Chad Gilbertson, who will walk you through their Makerspace journey. We hope you enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nancy Lindfors. I was a middle and high school science teacher for 14 years, and I've worked here at Learner's Edge for almost 3 years. As an educator whose philosophy was really anchored in constructivism and problem-based learning, Makerspaces really resonated with me and excited me as a way to engage students, empower them, and to help them develop those 21st century skills that are so important. So we thought it would be really helpful for you to hear firsthand from a successful maker, and that's Chad. So today we're going to be interviewing him and hearing about his story in hopes that you can learn from the things he's done to find success with Makerspaces. So I'm going to turn it over and let Chad introduce himself.
Hi guys, I am currently a third grade teacher and I'm in my 8th year of teaching elementary students. I guess I'm also a Learner's Edge evaluator as well, so I do that as well for the Learner's Edge team. My thinking is I've always tried to find ways to engage students through technology integration, creating authentic learning opportunities, and wanting students to have some choice in their learning. So I started the maker movement, started small with a few pieces. Got going with some things like Legos and Lego Mindstorms. After seeing, the engagement and creativity that students showed, I started looking for more ideas and expanded on that. And now we're at a point at my school where we all have a dedicated makerspace time for each classroom, and students get a chance to practice being makers each and every week.
Thanks, Chad. We are extremely excited to be here with you today and hope that as a result of attending this webinar, you'll be inspired to create your own makerspace for the students you serve. My role is really going to be facilitating, asking Chad questions so that he can tell his story and you can learn from that. And we're going to do our very best to pull as much great information out of Chad's brain as we can. Please note on this slide and in one of the, when you receive copy of this webinar, you'll have access to both of our emails. It's on this slide with our photos. So if you do have questions as you're processing the information we share today, please don't hesitate to reach out to one of us. Both Chad and I are open to fielding questions that you might send us by email as follow-up to this session today. So wanted to let you know that if you have additional questions that come up afterward, I know I'm a person who thinks of a great question after the fact. Do feel free to reach out to us with those questions. So you know a little bit about us. We'd like to learn a little bit about you. So we're going to ask you to participate in a little bit of a poll here and raise your hand if you consider yourself a maker already.
So you can go ahead and just use that little hand raise, the little hand in your control panel, and let us know if you consider yourself a maker. I'll give you a few seconds to do that.
The results are pouring in.
All right. So it looks like a little more than 1/3 of you would consider yourself already a maker.
So that's great. We have a good variety of folks joining in on our conversation today. Some of you with experience making, and some of you who this might be your first really dive into understanding the whole makerspace movement. So it sounds like our conversation will be a good fit for everyone attending. So our goals today are to cover really the following big buckets. We want to talk about, first of all, what is a makerspace? What are the benefits of makerspaces, kind of that all-important with them, the what's in it for me, and even more importantly, what's in it for your students? Some guiding questions that can help you build your vision and plan for implementation. And then we also want to share a wealth of resources with you in addition to Chad's great story and experience that you can take and investigate further after the webinar today. So we'd like to begin just with our own definition of makerspaces, and I say our own, meaning Chad and I agree on it, but we have borrowed this definition from Laura Fleming, who's the author of the book Worlds of Making, Best Practices for Establishing a Makerspace at Your School. And this definition just resonated with us, but we encourage you really to think about your needs and your students' needs. And your definition of a makerspace might look different than that. And one of the big takeaways that we want you to leave with today is that that's okay. Makerspaces look and feel different wherever we go. And it's about you customizing that for you and your needs and your students' needs. So our definition, a makerspace is a place where young people have an opportunity to explore their own interests, learn to use tools and materials, both physical and virtual, and develop creative projects. We really liked the student-centric facet of that, and we really see it as a shift from consumption and knowledge toward creation and action. We also wanted to share a great quote with you from Diana Lendina at renovatedlearning.com, who says, "We want to stress that a makerspace can be anything from a repurposed book cart filled with arts and craft supplies, to a table in a corner set out with Legos, to a full-blown fab lab with 3D printers, laser cutters, and hand tools." Again, reiterating the fact that no two school makerspaces are exactly alike, nor should they be. Makerspaces are unique as the school cultures they represent. So please make sure that as you're listening to Chad's story, you're thinking about, oh, there's an idea I could use if I just made this little tweak. So that's kind of the approach and the paradigm that we want you to bring to the conversation today. There are many potential benefits of makerspaces, and more research is being done to quantify what those benefits are. We believe that some of the benefits are that students really have this innate desire to make things. Makerspaces, we also believe, allow us to fail forward. And making things makes our thinking visible. So that helps us really understand more fully what students know and maybe where their thinking has gone astray. And collaborative makerspaces really encourage the sharing of ideas. And the whole idea of makerspaces, we feel, feeds into 21st century learning skills, the 4 C's, which are reflected on the slide: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. So those are some of the benefits that we feel makerspaces can bring to your classroom. What I'd like to do is take just a minute and bring Chad into the dialogue and ask him to share, given he's experienced makerspaces, what he feels the top 3 benefits have been for him as an instructor using the makerspaces, and then as a part 2, what are the benefits for his students using those spaces. So Chad, I'll have you jump in here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nancy. I think the benefits for both me and my students are kind of one and the same. Having just those hands-on, authentic learning opportunities to involve students in is so important, and that happens just naturally with the makerspace model. I also think that makerspace time really empowers students. It gives them choice in their learning. They can build off of what they maybe are interested in or what they're curious about when they're choosing kind of what they're working on during that makerspace time. And then I also think it's just a perfect fit for students to, kind of going back to what you said about the 4 C's, really improve on those collaboration, communication skills while working in groups, critical thinking, creativity pieces. And that really ties into some of those other academic content areas as well, because you want them working on those skills. If they're involved in a reading lesson or a math lesson, and I really see a strong connection between some of these skills that we're working on during Makerspace and then carrying over into some of those other subjects as well. So I think those would be the big things that really jump out to me for benefits of Makerspace.
Excellent. And we're going to pause here and ask for some audience participation. So in your question panel, we'd like you to weigh in and just share what, if anything, you think maybe we've missed or not hit on that could be a potential benefit of having students make in a makerspace. So feel free to type in some ideas that you have into your question box, and we'll then share those with the group. Looks like we have somebody who shared that one of the great things about making is that it is authentic learning and it can be relevant. That's a great addition. Thank you for sharing that, because as we know, learning is always more impactful for students when it seems connected to real life and the real world. So anytime we can help students make that connection, that's a bonus. Chad really hit on the fact that it helps to build community and build those collaboration skills. And the other thing that somebody shared, thank you, is that it supports student choice. And I think Chad will talk a little bit more about that as we go through conversations and how they are able to really create a student-centered makerspace where students do have choices. But he'll also talk a little more about kind of how he was able to build up to that place. All right. Thanks, everyone. So let's jump into some of those big guiding questions that can really help you to develop your own plan for a makerspace and then think about what implementation would look like for your makerspace. So here's where I'm really going to do a lot less talking and let Chad tell his story. So let's start, Chad, by talking about what was your inspiration? How did you get started with making?
Yeah, I think initially I heard about that term makerspace from a former colleague of mine that I used to teach with. We started sharing some ideas back and forth, and I started to realize some of those ideas that we were talking about were things I was already doing with students, hands-on activities, trying to give students choices, authentic learning opportunities. I had been using Legos, which is something I know we're all familiar with, to have students create some scenes for stories to write about. So we were actually using it in literacy. And then I started thinking, well, how could I use Legos in other areas of learning and maybe some STEM-based things? So I got into Lego Mindstorms, their EX kits, and you could do some programming. And I got a couple of those projects funded through Donors Choose. So then I got the Legos kind of integrated into my my weekly, or at least every couple of weeks plans, and kind of took off from there. I started to connect with some other educators, a lot through Twitter and Google Plus communities, to get ideas about makerspaces. And then I was also looking at 20% time, because I think that can fit in with the makerspace piece as well. So I jumped into more coding. I like that piece, so I kind of wanted to expand on that. So I got a smaller grant for some Sphero robotic balls, which really focused on STEM-based activities. And then I was also bringing some Osmo kits into our classroom, and then they also have a coding piece with those. So that was just kind of a way to enhance some of the iPads we already had. So as we're kind of getting some of these small pieces going, my principal became more interested in kind of what I was doing in my classroom and sharing with the other teachers in my unit. And we started to expand on some of those ideas more school-wide. So then finally, at the start of this school year, we received a larger grant from our local education foundation to purchase a much larger variety of makerspace materials. And we also got a large portable cart for those, which makes it easier to bring into any space in our school and turn that space into a makerspace. And now we've gone from kind of me having a few small pieces that could fit into a makerspace, and expanded that now into something larger, where we have that dedicated makerspace time each week, and every classroom and every teacher at my school has that time dedicated. So it's been great. We went from that one teacher piece into now we have 18 teachers that are all having that dedicated makerspace time each and every week. So it's been kind of a fun progression over the last 3 to 4 years.
Thank you, Chad. That's great. We'll talk more about grants in a little bit, but a key takeaway for me and what I'm hearing you say is that you found success by starting small, and you built on those successes. I also hear you saying that it was another teacher who inspired you, and so we're very hopeful that your participation and attendance in this webinar today, we're hopeful that we become that inspiration for you. And I also heard as a key takeaway that garnering that support from your administrator really helped you get kind of from doing things in a small capacity to expanding the program more universally across your school. So some key takeaways from that visioning process. Would that be a fair summary of what you shared?
Yes, no, absolutely, right on the mark.
Great. So talking more about that process, talk to us about how you set some goals for yourself in terms of what were your makerspace goals and how did you determine what they were? What kind of experience were you trying to create for you and for your students?
Yeah. I think initially when I started getting some of these smaller kind of pieces to bring in my classroom, I wanted to create opportunities for students to take what they know or maybe are learning and kind of test those ideas, have some more hands-on opportunities, and then learn from mistakes, and then kind of work towards the goal. So you learn from mistakes, like you said earlier, to kind of fall forward, and how can I take maybe a setback and really critically think about what's happening, and take that another step forward to solve goals. As I was doing that, and obviously there was some trial and error, and I think that's part of as that makerspace evolves, is trying some things and doing it with students and seeing really what works and what doesn't, and involving other teachers. So it wasn't just my thoughts, experiences, and ideas, but I'm getting other teachers involved in that thought process. So we kind of narrowed it down to really 3 areas to really focus on with our makerspace, and came up with 3 goals. One is We wanted our students and our staff to really embrace a growth mindset, shift that focus onto the process of learning, not just that end result. We also came up with a goal that we wanted to have an environment where students can experience failure, like I already said, and understand how they can problem solve and learn from those challenges. And that's one of those goals that really you can take from a makerspace and then really expand that and apply that to a lot of other areas. And then finally, we wanted to just create an environment where students are empowered to make choice and direct their learning, and the teachers take on that role as a facilitator to that learning. And those are kind of those goals that we really set on and have with our makerspace now.
Perfect, thank you. Chad, one kind of follow-up question I'd like to ask around goal setting. When you started off on this venture, it was a Chad venture, and you were able probably to say, this is what I want to do, and this is how I want to do it. But now you are working with a team of 18 other teachers, and you're all using the Makerspace. So talk a little bit how you've been able to successfully transition to kind of controlling all of this in terms of making your vision come to reality, to now the challenge of working with 18 people who might have 18 different visions and goals. How do you keep the group aligned and forward focused?
We have some time. We have something we do at our school, PLCs. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, learning communities of some fashion, and we just take some time consistently when we are talking and meeting to take some time to talk about our maker spaces and reflect on, hey, what are some things that are really going well and leading towards really good experiences for students and teachers, and then also maybe some things that we need to tighten up a little bit or to improve on. I think just having that constant communication among everyone, keeps us on the same page and keeps that idea of, what are our focus and how are we kind of tying it back to those three goals that I had mentioned earlier. We kind of had set those earlier in the school year. How are we coming back and making sure we are consistently meeting those and just having that open line of communication and really setting a precedent that, hey, we're all in this together. We're trying to get better. None of us have all of the right answers. So it's okay to admit we're stuck and need some help. And once, when we get everyone having that shared mindset, it really makes it a easy thing to do and just talk and share and continue to grow with our makerspace.
Thank you, Chad. Moving on to sort of the next bucket of guiding questions that you can use to help you formulate a plan and a direction for your makerspace. I think the next thing to really think about once you understood what your end game looked like is to figure out, okay, so how do I make this happen? And some of that is really thinking about the actual physical space. So talk to us about your physical space and how did you figure out what you already had and options for securing the additional equipment and materials that you wanted?
Sure. I think initially when we were thinking about, making this into a school-wide makerspace thing is just thinking actually about that physical space. And, will that be in a dedicated classroom where students and staff can go to do that, or do you need to be mobile? And in our case, we needed to be mobile. We need to be able to move and take that makerspace from one classroom to another because we don't have extra spaces. Either way can work. You just have to decide how is it going to work at your school. Next, I think you also need to then kind of go around and say, well, what pieces do we already have? Is there tools and materials that could be incorporated into a makerspace and check with teachers and staff of what they have that maybe they're not fully utilized, and that's a good way to find what you already have and and maybe there's some teachers that you work with, or you yourself already have some of those pieces that you kind of started small with, like I did, and then you can bring those into to benefit the whole group. And then as far as what you mentioned, how do you get what you don't have? Donations from families can work. Sometimes there's something like Legos can be great that families are done with, and they can certainly work. Finding out if building funds are available, look for local grants, regional grants, and then finally, local businesses that are willing to partner with your school can be a good resource as well.
Great, thank you. And this is a great time to talk a little more about materials, Chad. I know that through our conversation, you've talked with me in great detail about truly your makerspace and what it looks like. And I know on the next slide we have an actual picture of your makerspace, which is here, I'll forward that right away so folks can see it. They use a cart. And we have a great question from Susan in our audience asking, do all the teachers share materials in your makerspace? Who keeps it stocked? So maybe as we launch into this next question, Chad, you can talk a little more about your cart system and address those questions for Susan in terms of sharing materials and stocking materials. That would be, I think, helpful for her.
Sure. Yeah, you can kind of see our cart right there. So it's on wheels. It's a lockable cart. So it gets left. We have a common space where teachers can access that we, when we're done with it in our classroom, we wheel it back to that spot so everyone knows where it's at. It also took a little bit of planning to make sure that no one planned their makerspace time, at the same time, so we don't overlap. Once we figure that out, then it's most of the kits are not things that are like consumables. They can get reused. So then a lot of it is just teaching the students to make sure they're working kind of in their own space and not mix kits up. With each of the containers you can see there. And if students are putting them back in the right spots, that helps. And then once a week, we just rotate through staff members. We have a list of, here are the materials, and here's what needs to be in each box. We just do a end of the week check-in. Staff members rotate through to make sure that everything's where they're supposed to be. And if things are getting low, we have a couple of kits, like a loom weaving kind of kit, and then also there's a bracelet making kit. Some of those materials can run out, so we just have to take a quick inventory of those to know if we need to replace some of those items. But mostly through that shared staff and just kind of a check-in and pre-teaching students to get things put back, we've had really good luck with keeping everything in that cart.
And Chad, just to go back, so if you find that inventory for a certain kit is getting low, how is that replenished? What's the process you use?
Yep, we had at the beginning of the year, we have just a set dollar amount where we kind of set that aside, knowing that we'll probably need to replace this. So we check that, and we have our secretary is wonderful. She has that list, and as soon as we need something reordered, she already has it saved and ready to go, and it's at that school the next week at some point. So I think my class has had one day where one of the kits was too low to use it, where we were just waiting on something to get here. But other than that, we never had a problem with students not being able to dive into one of the cubbies that they want to.
Chad, one question I have for you is how, if at all, did you, and I know you're working with elementary age students, so you might have made these decisions without student input, but how, if at all, did you incorporate student input into your design process? Do they have any feedback around your cart, or has their input helped you redesign any of that in any way?
So initially, at the beginning of the school year, we had about half the materials in that cart, and kind of a variety of different things that students could dive in with. And based on kind of what was popular, and we did a few surveys. K-5 as far as getting opinions from the different grade levels and age if there's different interests there. And then we were able to purchase, the other materials based on what they wanted more of. We also presented some ideas that we knew other schools had in their makerspaces. I said, hey, here's another idea. What do you guys think of this? Or here's another tool. You can kind of see at the bottom there. There's a thing called contraptions. Those are as simple as wood blocks, and we didn't have those in there right away. We presented those as one of the ideas. Like, hey, here's another kit that other students are using at other makerspace. What do you think? And I think that's probably the one K-5 that's most popular at the time. So we got some student input on filling in the rest of our makerspace for this year.
Perfect, thank you. And just closing the loop on thinking about space and materials, and this is what we have, this is what we want to do, how do we get from what we have to what we want to do. I promised we would come back to this topic, and you've mentioned a couple times being able to support some of your efforts through grant funding. So wanted to give you some space now to talk a little bit about that, Chad, in terms of how did you know where to go to get that very first grant that kind of launched you into making? And you've gotten several grants. Have all of your efforts been winners? Or talk to us about some of your lessons learned around the whole grant process, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Individually, I would thought it's really easy to go through Donors Choose, which is a site, if you haven't checked it out, you should. Very easy to go on there and get an item or two or three and see if you can get those funded and collect donations from all over the place. So that's where I started with a few pieces. For example, the Lego Mindstorm kits that I mentioned, and also a few Sphero robotic balls. Then I was able to expand on that through we have a local education foundation who has a grant cycle every year, and I wrote several grants through them. And I had several grants that were not funded. So I was able to get feedback on why those grants weren't selected. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned is to make sure your grants really tie as closely as possible to that mission of whatever organization you're seeking funding from. If you can further their mission through your grants, then you have a lot better chance of getting funded. So I really learned to pay attention to that and see how I could really match what they were looking for and what they wanted to see accomplished. And I've had, when I take that to heart, I've had a lot of success.
Did anybody help you write that first grant? Did you do that on your own? Was there someone you talked to?
Good question. I'm lucky to work with a staff who has also had some success writing grants for some other pieces. So it wasn't Makerspace or maybe technology related, but a couple other staff members that I work with had some successful grants there was actually some nature, outdoor education related grants a few years previous to that, and through a different organization, but it kind of gave me some motivation and some encouragement of, okay, this is not something that you need to be a professional to do, something that you just kind of have to be willing to jump in, take some time, and then get some help if you can, just having people proofread it and bounce some ideas off of to really help that grant come together. So it's kind of a nice thing to have another team or at least another teammate or two to support you with. I did all the grant writing for these on my own, but I did have kind of input to maybe make sure that my goals and my mission and what I wanted to accomplish with this were clear, just to kind of get some other people to read it who maybe don't know as much about Makerspaces, my end result, just making sure that I was communicating it clearly to them, which would be similar to trying to communicate it clearly to whoever is reading those grant applications as well. So getting some feedback there was really helpful.
Great. So before we kind of move on to the next segment, just kind of recapping what we talked about in terms of designing your space. Um, some tips for folks if you don't have a space that you might designate for making. The mobile cart can obviously be successful, which is the approach that Chad and his fellow teachers have taken to meet their needs. If you do have a space, one thing that's become very popular is actually converting some library space to making and looking at how we might really shift the paradigm of what libraries are and what libraries do. But if you do have a space that you might be able to designate, you might want to really think about the look and feel, how to make your space open and welcoming, and practical. You know, you want to think about utilities, lighting, outlets, sink, storage, shelving, Wi-Fi, communication tools like a bulletin board, a smart TV, computers, all of those pieces in terms of what will make your space practical in terms of supporting the goals you have for your space. A very key thing to consider, of course, is going to be the safety of the space. You don't want cords stretched across the room that students could trip over, or materials that could be damaged in any way, shape, or form. So really thinking about safety of your space. You also might take a sort of hybrid approach and have some fixed spaces or stations, but then also have a cart with some flexibility that allows you to do a little bit of both. You might have a space where you always have Legos, but then there's a space where every month you refresh it with new things that students can do. So thinking about all of those ways to make your space fit your needs. And really reiterating the theme we've been hearing from Chad, and that is it's okay to start small and build on those successes and expand as you go and learn and find your way. So don't forget also to then include students if that's something that makes sense for you in the design process so that they feel like it is truly their space where they can go explore, create, collaborate, and fail forward. So let's talk now about sort of a day in the life of the makerspace. Who leads that student experience? What are the expectations for students? So what does it look like when I bring my students to the makerspace or when I bring the makerspace to my students? How do you make the magic happen, Chad?
I think a lot of it is just to give students that chance to have hands-on, collaborative, learning opportunities. I think in my classroom and my fellow teachers that I work with, it's kind of an organized chaos when Makerspace is going. You have groups of students all over the place doing different things, and that's great. They're taking some things that they're interested in or want to practice more of, and really taking that to heart and practicing on that. One thing that I've really found is important is to make sure that students understand the purpose behind that makerspace time. You want to share or have them share the goals that they have, with whatever kit or materials they're using, and kind of really think about and hopefully be able to share with you kind of their plan and their steps as they're working through it. So we spent some time, talking about goal setting, what makes a good goal. Oftentimes, that's just for that one makerspace day, and then it's going to be something different later. Just with our mobile cart, it's hard to carry over projects from one makerspace time to another. So it's kind of a short-term thing each time for us. But I know other schools do makerspaces where students can start and then they can continue it a few days later or whenever they meet because they have a dedicated space. So whatever works for you is great. Once you have those kind of pieces in place, students really can take it from there. They understand that sense of purpose and are able to clearly communicate it with teachers and then also with their group mates and who they're working with. Then the teacher can kind of shift into that role of a facilitator, asking lots of questions, prompting a lot, encourage higher level thinking, and just making sure that the students can really take it from there. We set some expectations in our makerspace. One, we just said we want to have fun learning. We always want to make sure that we're working together to help each other out. We want to make sure we ask lots of questions and also listen to questions. And that's an important thing for my third grade students. A lot of times they're really good at asking. That listening piece is a challenge, and that's not just in makerspace time. That's everywhere. So that's kind of one of those good skills to really reinforce that I think carry over if we're doing a collaborative math group later in the day or a reading group, the next morning. So that's kind of a fun connection that we make often. And then finally, just keeping them to stay focused on working towards their goal. And their goals can change and they can be flexible, but just to kind of have what are they working for and being able to share that.
Thanks, Chad. And just to kind of dive a little deeper in terms of some specifics, Susan asked a great question. Is all you're making free choice, or are you giving them a specific project and they have an end goal and requirements to meet? So can you talk a little more about the approach the approach you take there?
Yep. I kind of did a gradual release with my students. So at the beginning of the year, we didn't, the cart as we showed the picture a few slides ago, it wasn't as full. There was just maybe about half the stuff in there, and we came up with, kind of some targeted. Hey, here's what we should see if we can accomplish by the end of this makerspace time. And I gave them the goal, and then it shifted to so I came up with a goal, and then it was all right. Let's come up with a goal together. So then before each group would dive in, we would take. I'd give them a couple of minutes to kind of talk as a group and what's your goal going to be? They would check in with me. And I would maybe help them refine that goal before they started diving in, and then they'd go. And now at this point of the year, students are kind of more of now they're doing that. They're doing their goal setting. They're deciding which kit they want to dive into, and then they come up with their goals that they want to work towards during that makerspace. So it kind of was a gradual shift from the beginning of the year up until this point as far as who was doing the goal setting, and a shift more toward more student choice and independence in that part of the makerspace. So I hope that answers your question.
I think so. Thank you. Again, sort of starting small and building on those successes as you go. I'm hearing that as a steady theme. Chad, another question that I have is, it sounds like your space is designed to be very student-centered, and I'd like to know how you convinced 18 people to begin to do this, because I know for some teachers it can be really scary to sort of let go of that control and turn the learning over to students. So can you talk about whether or not any teachers really struggled with that, and maybe how you and or your administration team or the PLC worked to help support those peers through that paradigm shift?
Sure. Well, I think one piece that's important is, if your administrator is involved in, kind of pushing that importance of diving into the makerspace and kind of making it a thing like, hey, we're going to do this. Not we could do this, but we're going to do this. That really helps to kind of push some teachers along the course. I think a lot of teachers that I know that maybe struggled with kind of, well, how is this going to be purposeful? How is this going to really help my students overall? And I think I touched on a little bit earlier, but talking about how during a makerspace time we have skills that we are working on and focusing on that really can be applied to all those other content areas. So it's not that we're we're taking away maybe some time we would have been working on math or reading or social studies and just missing it. You're working on skills like critical thinking, collaboration, some creativity that hopefully you find are pieces that are important in your other academic areas. STEM connections are kind of a natural fit for me to see those connections with a lot of the makerspace activities that we have with at our school. And I know other teachers have used makerspace time as a springboard for creative storytelling and tie those into literacy. So I think kind of making some of those connections that way really helps to get some teachers that are maybe a little reluctant to dive in. And then also just talk about how, hey, when we are working on collaboration during this makerspace time, think how that's going to help your students work on maybe it's in a reading group, right? And they're something with some shared reading or those communication skills that they need when they're listening and sharing with each other about a book. If they're solving math problems together, and the critical thinking skills that they're working on Makerspace, how that translates later to math and improving that community and environment and those skills really tie together. And I think if you can help teachers make that connection, a lot easier to get them on board. And then just kind of having conversations about mindset and kind of having a growth mindset, both ourselves as teachers, and then how can we share that with students? It won't be perfect right away, and making sure teachers understand that and kind of jump into that realizing that's okay. And then you take that time to reflect with staff members, maybe it's during a TLC, or if you can find some other time, before, after school, maybe it's through an online, chat. So maybe you have a school Google Plus community or a Slack channel or something where you're able to, on your own time, share a couple comments a couple times a week to get people talking, even if you can't meet, physically, face to face. That's certainly another option that works. So just having that reflection and, hey, what's going well? What are we struggling with? And just keeping that open dialogue really helps to get everyone on board and moving forward with it.
Thank you, Chad. I love that you mentioned that you are conscientious about and purposeful about using makerspaces to connect to all facets of the curriculum. And Susan mentioned that, yes, it's really important for teachers to see how these skills are complementing the standards and learning targets they have regardless of the content area. So thank you, Chad, and thank you, Susan, for making a point of mentioning that. To kind of wrap things up, I want to ask Chad to do two things, to look back and then to look forward. First, looking back, Chad, maybe talk to us about, your biggest lessons learned. What, if anything, would you do differently based on what you know now? And then kind of as a part two, looking forward, how do you intend to keep the momentum going for your makerspace, and how will you keep it funded as your space continues to evolve?
Sure. I think, well, I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but just kind of that sense of purpose and making sure students understand, why they're involved with Makerspace, why you're taking time to do that. I don't think I always I knew what the purpose was. I don't think I always would made that clear to students. So that's something that, kind of thinking back, I wish I would have been more purposeful and more clear in communicating, the why we were doing this with students from the get-go. And I think that would have helped kind of launch some of that makerspace time and just been a little bit more productive from an earlier point. That also gave me a good talking point and sharing point when other teachers were diving in, and I was like, well, here's something that wasn't working so well for me, and as I reflected, I kind of realized why and how that was a very easy fix for me. Another key, and I touched on this, but just kind of starting small and kind of growing from there. That's kind of how I did it, and I think that's just a really nice way of building, kind of build on a couple of those pieces you get comfortable with, and then expand from there instead of try to take, bite off more than you can chew from the get-go. As far as keeping the momentum going, I think another next step for us is to try to involve some community outside of the school, some businesses, or even some family members, families of in our school, to see if they are willing to contribute some resources to keep our makerspace, kind of going and expanding, because it's kind of fun to continue to be able to bring in some new pieces to keep it fresh, to keep it engaging, as well as we set we've set just some money aside in our budget now to kind of replace some of those consumables for some of the kits that will need to be pieces replaced, and some of the pieces that might get broken or lost, because when kids are actually using things, sometimes things do get broken or do get lost. It's just kind of a reality that you want to make sure you think about and plan for that.
Great. One of the things I've heard you say throughout is that the key to start small, and I think just reiterating that allows you and your students to build your competence and confidence in this new way of learning, which is very different than traditional learning. And that you really don't have to be fancy. It's more about mindset than materials. But Susan raised a great point that maybe you can speak to, Chad. It sounds like your mobile kits are fairly unplugged, but you also mentioned some of the coding and more high-tech stuff you might be doing with your students. So can you talk about how you're teaching coding with the carts? And I think if I go back several slides, we have a picture these are pictures from your classroom of some of the tech that we're using. So would you mind speaking to that briefly, Chad?
Sure. Well, the picture there that's the Osmo kit that we have, or we have several of them, and then the pieces there are for the Osmo coding piece that they have. So the boxes for the Osmo kits stay in the Makerspace cart. Our school, each of our classrooms has between 5 and 7 iPads, so those are available for use. So we just have the Osmo apps, and then also Sphero apps are loaded on each of the iPads. And then with the Sphero balls, it's a little trickier because they have to be paired up with Bluetooth. So we have just a sticker code. Blue stickers for the blue Sphero, and the yellow is for the yellow. So we just have one set of iPads that works with those, and there happen to be the ones in my classroom. So then I'm a little bit more flexible during other classrooms' makerspace time, knowing that they probably will need to borrow those most of the time, which is fine. It's just one of those things that you want to think about ahead of time. And the Osmo pieces just stay with the cart, and so that the Sphero stuff isn't mobile, because we do want to keep that charged and plugged in. So I just keep that in an easily accessible spot in my room, where the other teachers or students from other classrooms, when they have makerspace time, they just come and grab it, and they just put them back in when they're done, and that works out really easily. We're not a huge school, so we know where things are at. I don't know if I explained. So we have 18 teachers, but we actually have 3 separate small schools that I work with. So my building individually is only 6 teachers, one for K 1 through 5. So being a little bit smaller that way, sharing those materials that way, with not quite everything being on that cart, does work. Bigger schools probably have to think of the logistics a little bit differently. But I do know one option that a school that I started following a while ago down in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, they have a cart they have a Sphero cart. They have 30 of them in there, I believe, or 25. And just everything's plugged in, and then they just have a location where then just that cart just has to get plugged into one spot. So at the end of the day, it's plugged in, and they keep everything together that way. So there's different ways to work about it, but definitely something you do want to think about, especially if you have a mobile cart, to keep things accessible and available for everyone.
Thank you, Chad. As kind of a wrap up, and before we close and talk about the resources that we have for you as takeaways, I'd like to just pick Chad's brain one last time and ask him to share what he has found to be the greatest resource he uses in terms of staying current, getting new ideas, and that sort of thing. So, Chad, what's the best resource you've found related to Makerspaces that you would recommend to the folks on the call?
Yep. I personally love to get on Twitter, and I just find there's so many things that are getting posted on there. It's a great place. You can spend a few minutes or you can spend a few hours finding things that are on there, and using the hashtags, either hashtag MakerED, hashtag Makerspace, or hashtag Makerspaces. Those are probably the three that I look at the most when I'm looking for Makerspace related tweets. And there's just all sorts of great ideas, resources, and what I like the most is, teachers sharing out what they're doing in their classroom. So maybe you can get a picture or an idea of, oh, this is how this fits into Makerspace. Awesome. And just see how it's actually being used.
Would you just repeat one more time those 3 key Twitter handles for the group,
Oh, yeah.
in case people are taking notes?
Sure, no problem. The first one was just hashtag MakerED, so MakerED, and then hashtag Makerspace, and finally hashtag Makerspaces, so just the plural version of Makerspace.
Chad, we have a question from the audience about following you. Do you have a Twitter handle that you're willing to share with the group?
Sure, I do. My Twitter handle is at Chad, C-H-A-D, Gustav, G-U-S-T-A-V-E.
Thank you. Well, we've got about 2 minutes. If there are any additional questions from the audience, we are happy to take them now. Otherwise, please remember that our email addresses were on the front of the presentation, which you'll have access to. So again, if you're a person who is driving home and that's when you think of your great question, don't hesitate to send that to one or both of us by email. We're happy to help you that way. So feel free to follow up with questions that way. And while we're waiting for folks who might want to ask those questions, I will just quickly reiterate for you that we do have some great resources available for you. The resources that we have available for you, there are 2 PDFs, and the PDFs are going to cover topics that include some ideas for funding. Where might you go to pursue grants that are related to maker spaces and the maker movement? There are some activity ideas for you. So if you're looking for what does an activity look like that might take place in a maker space, there are loads of those. And then there are a couple links to some very successful maker spaces that you can explore and add to the story you heard from Chad today. I know it's always helpful to get lots of ideas of what your space might look like so that, again, you start to match your vision to the needs that you and your students have.
And as Nancy just said, the handouts are available for download. I will also send you a link where you can come to a web page. You can watch the webinar, share it with your colleagues again, download the handouts, and download the presentation slides on the website. Like I said, you'll get that in about 24 hours. So I just want to say a huge thank you to both Chad and Nancy for all the hard work they put into this presentation and sharing their experiences in the maker movement. And a huge thank you to you for joining us today. Thank you very much for taking time out of your Monday afternoon. And please be in touch should you have any questions. We appreciate your time, and thank you. Have a great night.